Hi everyone, welcome to our chapter 3 review over prenatal development. I'm going to fly through these slides because it is a very detailed chapter and I'm going to try to take you through the big ideas. So let's get going. All right, so these are the really big ideas. The genetics aspect of prenatal development, the main stages of prenatal development, and finally, we'll end with the approaches to childbirth, labor and delivery processes, and there's a whole lot more that you're going to hear. So let's get moving. But remember that you want to take notes while you're watching this video, and you're trying to look for unique video content. Don't forget about that. All right, so when it comes to gene code, there's two types of gametes. Males provide the sperm and females provide the ova. The male gametes and the female gametes both are in a haploid state, which means they have half of the genetic material needed. And once they come together, when a single sperm unites with the nucleus of the egg, they form what's called a single-celled organism called the zygote. And that zygote typically will be formed in the fallopian tubes, and then it will start traveling down as it starts what is called cell division and multiplication. Chromosomes, just real quick, some information on chromosomes. You know that they're made of DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, and they have pairs. They have these base pairs that come together. So adenine with thymine and guanine with cytosine. As far as your genes, they each have variations, different matchings of these pairs come together. And as far as during meiosis, that's when you will see that these segments of the chromosomes will form pairs and make some exchanges. And sometimes this goes wrong and there are mutations. So we'll talk about those briefly. But some of the key words that you need to know when it comes to gene code, you want to know the genotype versus phenotype distinction. So genotype would be like the genetic makeup. And then the phenotype is what's expressed on the outside, the physical characteristics. We are composed of 23 chromosomes in every single cell of our body, and even our hair carries that, and our skin cells. And our 23rd pair are called the sex chromosomes, and that's what determines whether we are male or female. So if you're a female, you're an XX on the 23rd pair, and if you're a male, you're an XY. And only the males can determine if a male is made. So females can only contribute an X chromosome, but males are the ones who can contribute either an X or a Y. And there are many women who died in history, correct, for not being able to have males, and it was actually the male who was the culprit, right? So that was misdirected punishment. As far as genetic inheritance, you're going to see some. Let's move on to this one. Let's talk about some as far as what we pass on to our kids, right? So dominant genes are usually what's going to be expressed. And here in this Punnett square, you see the dominant being expressed as a capital letter. And so if a dominant gene is present, it is what's going to be an override as far as the phenotype. It's what's going to be expressed. So if there's a dominant gene here, you can see here in this combination, there's a dominant N, there's a dominant N here, and therefore all three of these squares right here, all three of these, if these were offspring, all of them would show the dominant trait. So a recessive trait, such as blue eyes are recessive, and they require for the offspring to receive the recessive gene from both mom and dad. And so for blue eyes to be present, you would need a little b and a little b from mom and dad. So mom and dad could be brown-eyed phenotypically, they would have a big B here and a little b, a big B here and a little b, but they are carriers for the blue eyes. And this is how two brown-eyed parents can have a blue-eyed baby. So no, it wasn't the milkman, it wasn't the lechero, right, that we like to blame it on. It can very possibly happen where a blue-eyed baby comes from two brown-eyed parents. And brown is typically dominant. There's actually a pecking order for eye color. And, you know, when you put like green and blue and violet, there's actually a pecking order as for recessive traits. And so blue is recessive in comparison to brown. But in comparison to green, green would be dominant to the blue. So yeah, it's interesting how that works. As far as abnormalities, like I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of things that could go wrong during meiosis. There can be everything that you see listed here. There could be deletions. So these are the three big ones that can occur. As a chromosome is duplicating, instead of actually being the same as it was before, sometimes genetic content can be deleted, leading to a mutation. You can also have duplication of genetic material. So here in this example, you can see that this from here to here, this allele was supposed to be just duplicated, but instead got duplicated onto the receiving chromosome, and therefore that would be a mutation. And then finally inversion. And so this was the order, and then it gets inverted in the resulting chromosome. So those are just some of the effects or the causes of some of these mutations. As far as abnormalities, some of the most common chromosomal abnormalities, if you've heard of Down syndrome, that is called trisomy 21. And so you're only supposed to have pairs, right? Okay, so we are made of 23 pairs of chromosomes. But Down syndrome involves having 3 chromosomes on pair number 21. So what was supposed to be a pair instead ends up as a tripad. And so there is, that can lead to obviously many effects. Another area where we can have a lot of abnormalities is on the sex-linked chromosomes, and that would be the 23rd pair. So we can have all kinds of variations take place on that 23rd pair. And also we carry certain diseases on that 23rd pair. So for example, hemophilia, color blindness, and albinism, those are all carried on the 23rd chromosomes. And so those are passed on through the 23rd pair. Also, we can have variations in what we end up with in that 23rd pair. So instead of having a pair, we could end up with just a single chromosome. And that also would be a mutation and a problem. So for example, Turner syndrome, right? And this occurs in 1 out of every 2,500 live female births. And that's when an ovum is lacking a chromosome and it gets fertilized by a sperm with an X chromosome. So instead of ending up with a pair on the 23rd pair, it ends up with just a single X. There's also Klinefelters, and instead of ending up with a pair, they end up with 2 X's and a Y. And this one occurs about 1 in every 700 live male births, and it results when there's an extra X chromosome that gets fertilized by a Y sperm. So as you can see, and these are just some of the many, many variations and mutations that can occur genetically. As far as testing in advance for it, we do have very advanced methods now that can be used and are much more affordable and accessible than they used to be. When I first started teaching about 30 years ago, it was in the thousands, like, 40, 50,000 to do some kind of genetic screening. And it had to be something you knew about so that they could look for it in a targeted way. Now we have much more accessibility and it's much more affordable, and it can even be often covered by insurance. So we have prenatal screenings that can lead to a prenatal diagnosis. Those screenings don't only involve ultrasounds and blood tests, but also can involve genetic testing, especially when there is genetic diseases in the family suspected. As far as behavioral genetics, this is just an area that we covered when we were talking about the different areas in lifespan development. And so there are certain diseases and disorders that have a very strong genetic component. And when that's the case, we have explored them genetically. So, for example, schizophrenia has a genetic component. So does depression. And so when we know that there's a strong genetic component, then, there's been quite a bit more research that's been done in that area. And often this research involves twin studies. And twin studies are ways that they can compare and see if there's a monozygotic or a dizygotic twin. And monozygotic, I think I have a slide on that, involves they're coming from the same zygote and they ended up splitting. Therefore, you have two exactly, genetically exactly offspring, and they're completely identical. And that would be genotypically, right? The difference is that twins, even though when they're identical twins, they don't necessarily look exactly the same. And that's phenotype. That's the difference between genotype and phenotype. Dizygotic twins come from two different zygotes that were both fertilized in the womb at the same time. And those, we know them as fraternal twins, but they're share no more genetic material than you and an older sibling. You just kind of happen to share the womb time, right? Okay, but as far as gene code, you are just as similar as, because you have the same mother and the same father as contributors. As far as the differences in twins, like twin research, it's very interesting. And lifespan theorists like to study twins who are monozygotic, but who end up in different environments. That's kind of a classic study to explore when you're trying to see the effects of gene code versus environment. And so that gets done a lot, right? And anytime they have that situation, not that it gets done a lot because that's not very common to find that, but when you do have twins who are genetically similar but end up being raised in different environments, it helps researchers establish, well, how much of that was gene code and how much of it was environmental. All right, the next stage of this chapter is prenatal development. And that one's super important. Well, first of all, that's the title of the chapter, but also these are the three big stages that you want to know, and you want to know them well as you're reading this chapter. Living in El Paso, we see a lot of people who sometimes enter into pregnancy without enough knowledge about what critical things are happening and how early they are happening. So much like when you took the orientation for our class, and I told you that you're in a 5-week class and there's a lot of stuff moving very, very quickly. Imagine being pregnant and, finding out, wow, here you were 2 months pregnant and you thought, you didn't really have to be worried about anything until your baby bump started showing. And then you find out, no, actually, most of the really, really critical stuff already took place because that was in the embryonic stage. So, I want you to know as you go through this chapter and you're reading this section and watching this video that each of these stages are important, but the embryonic stage really is the highlight of everything that's essential. This is the building stage, and it's when everything that's really important, such as the brain and the cardiovascular system, and all the major organ formation, it's happening here. And so a lot of times, and look how early that is. That's week 3 to week 8. So let's go through each of these stages so you can see what's happening in each stage. So the first stage is the germinal stage. And for each of these stages, I'm going to give you one big word that hopefully stands out for you. And so this is the stage where the zygote was formed, single cell organism. It starts traveling down the fallopian tubes and it starts multiplying and eventually becomes like 150 cell, sphere, a sphere of 150 undifferentiated cells. They all are exactly the same. They have not yet been told to become heart tissue or brain tissue. None of that has happened, which is called specialization. Instead, they're undifferentiated, and they are full of potential. And at that point, they're called stem cells, right? And so they're traveling down the fallopian tube. And by the time they make it to the uterus, they need to implant. So in the first stage, you want to think germinal period, weeks 1 to 2, and the word that should stand out for you is implantation. The second stage, like I mentioned earlier, and the most significant and most important, and if any teratogens are present in the stage, it can really affect embryonic development, and that would be the embryonic period. This is, as far as importance, this is the one that should be like neon lights flashing, red flag, red flag. This is where we need to know, hey, look at all the stuff that's happening here, right? Cells begin to differentiate. Systems and organ systems begin to form. Heart, neural tube development. And neural tube eventually becomes the brain and the spinal cord. And so that is so essential and so important, because obviously, if we are exposed to some kind of teratogenic agent, some kind of outside, or even something that we have internally, sometimes such as our stress hormones, that could cause some kind of malformation, some kind of problem in that development of that organ system. And so when you think embryonic period, think organ formation. And then, that stage, I just can't highlight it enough. And it is a stage where 20% of organisms fail during this stage, because, it's just so critical. And I often use the example of if you were, baking a cake from scratch. And let's say somebody walks in and they come to you and they start talking to you and distracting you, and there you were, trying to measure flour, sugar, how many eggs, how much milk do I need, how much vanilla. And let's say somebody's really distracting you. When do you think it'll be like the more impacting to you? If they come in when you're first putting all the stuff together, or if they come to you once all the stuff was already put together and you were just kind of baking it in the oven. And that's what the fetal period is. The fetal period is everything has already been established, but now it just needs to mature. So when you think fetal period, think maturation. And this is your fetus from about 9 weeks to the full gestational period, which is 40 weeks. At 9 weeks, it's about the size of a kidney bean, and it does have is the beginnings of what might look human. And notice all these markers: 12 weeks having all its body parts, 16 weeks being about 4.5 inches long. At 24 weeks, organ systems are still continuing to develop and mature, but you're already having rudimentary neurons, right, in the brain being developed. And then the fetus reaches the age of viability. And the age of viability is the age at when that fetus might be able to survive if outside the womb. So if it was born between 22 to 26 weeks after reaching the age of viability, it has a much higher survival rate than if it was born before the age of viability. And finally, the last marker here is that by week 37, all of the fetus's organ systems are fully developed enough that it could survive. Pretty much, you have a much higher percentage that it could survive outside the mother's womb. Okay, back to the 3 stages. When we think germinal, implantation, embryonic, organ formation, and fetal period, maturation. As far as teratogens, you heard me say these are any agents that can pose a risk for the developing embryo and or fetus. Now, the earlier you're exposed to any of these, and it's not just alcohol and tobacco, it can be maternal diseases, it could be measles and chickenpox, it could be drugs that the mother is taking, and not all of them, malicious. They could be drugs that were needed for high blood pressure, or for maybe it was an antidepressant. For many, many years, they told women, don't worry about taking your Prozac, take your Prozac. And then now, what are they saying? Was your child born with cleft palate? Was your child born with a birth defect? Were you on Prozac? And so, drugs, alcohol, anything that you're exposed to during development can be teratogenic and can contribute to birth defects. Now, alcohol, sadly, is one of the most preventable, and a lot of times, women don't start taking care of themselves until they find out they're pregnant, which could be, 6, 8 weeks later. And let's go back to our timeline. 6 to 8 weeks later, what are we talking about? Well, maybe she was still drinking or partying, or maybe she was still taking her medications and didn't know she was pregnant. So this is what I tell all my students. When should someone, a female, start taking care of herself? Well, if she's sexually active. If she's sexually active and she has the potential of getting pregnant, then she should be taking care of herself. And it's not just about having like protected or unprotected sex, because oftentimes those measures of protection fail. And so recognizing that, hey, if you're sexually active, you have the potential of getting pregnant, and therefore you need to be aware that any of these things can be teratogenic, and also that you don't need to be an ongoing drunk. Fetal alcohol syndrome can take place from just one binge episode at just the right time. Sorry, excuse me. And so, recognizing, hey, we need to be aware of all these agents that we're exposed to and do our best to control those that we can control. Because there's a lot of, you already saw that there's a lot of possibilities for mutations that are out of our control. Why would we want to add to that by actually drinking? And, we live in El Paso, and I don't know if you know this, but El Paso used to come up on Budweiser's national rankings as #2 sales in the country. So, it's important to know we like to drink in El Paso, and a lot of times we consider it, just a regular social activity, not recognizing that it could, be a factor for something that would affect the child for their lifetime. So, making ourselves aware of it and making everyone we know aware of it, because how sad is that, right? Okay, to bring on fetal alcohol syndrome that was 100% preventable. And we see a lot of FAS, spectrum disorders, in El Paso. Right. So recognizing that. And then, with smoking, smoking is affiliated and connected with low birth weight, actually. And so a lot of times babies that are born to mothers who smoke end up being born early, premature, and they also end up being born with low birth weight. And that's something that can definitely affect your survival rate. So, do your best to control those things which you can control, even to including occupational hazards, such as, maybe there's toxins at work. Maybe there are radiation. Maybe there's radiation that you're exposed to at work. And, recognizing all the things that can affect an unborn embryo and or a fetus, depending on what stage we're talking about. And the list is very long. If you have ever seen the Berger development textbook, that one, it has like almost 3 pages of all the teratogenic risks that babies face. And so there's STI risks, and having syphilis definitely can affect an unborn a baby, and maternal diseases, and stress levels, because stress is very toxic, and we release like cortisol and all the corticosteroids that we release that can be teratogenic to our babies. And then some of the things that can affect whether it results in a birth defect or not involve when were you exposed? So, the earlier you were exposed and the closer it was to the embryonic period, the more likely it is to cause like a major birth defect and major effects. But also, how long were you exposed to it, right? And then, your gene code, of course, like, is it in your gene code? And, are you male or female? So, males, believe it or not, are actually more likely to be vulnerable to damage from teratogenic agents than females. Females are considered the hardier gene code. So I don't know if you knew that. I think that's pretty cool. As far as complications, there's many things that can happen during pregnancy. Now that we're entering this last stage of the chapter, and if you have had babies, maybe you remember yourself being pregnant for the first time, and you're terrified. A lot of times women were very scared. I know I was, and I was asking everybody, what they went through and what they felt and all those things. But oftentimes, like even in your pregnancy, and pregnancy, I want you to think of it differently than prenatal development. Pregnancy stages, those are from the mother's perspective. This is the mother being pregnant and what she encounters. So things like nausea and morning sickness at the beginning, and heartburn and gas and hemorrhoids, the joy of hemorrhoids, having a backache, especially as that baby, enters the last trimester and really starts gaining weight and maturing, leg cramps, insomnia, constipation, all those things. Those are from the mother's perspective. So pregnancy and the stages of pregnancy are the mother's perspective. Prenatal development is all about the baby. And so, you want to look at the process here from two different perspectives. Because, yes, there's a baby growing inside a woman's womb, but the woman is experiencing it from her side, and the baby goes through its stages respectively, right? And there are many different things that can pose risks to the mother. She could face gestational diabetes. She could face preeclampsia. She could have deep vein thrombosis, right? She could suddenly become very susceptible to infections. And she could also have peripartum cardiomyopathy, right? And so just all the different, these are not all of them. These are just some of the things that can suddenly pop up while you're pregnant. And, I don't like these statistics, but it's about 830 women dying every day around the world. Now, this is around the world. That's the only good news, is it isn't just in one country, but all over the world. But most of them happening in developing countries, not in industrialized countries. And so there are still, sadly, pregnancy-related deaths, women who die while pregnant or die within that first year of the pregnancy. And so what else can we say about this? As far as the success rate of the baby, you have spontaneous abortions, miscarriage, approximately 20 to 40% of undiagnosed pregnancies, and about 10% of diagnosed pregnancies. And typically, a miscarriage will take place before the 12th week of pregnancy. And it can be very, very emotionally harsh for a female to have a miscarriage in the later trimesters, especially in the third trimester, because by then, there's just a lot of bonding that takes place between a woman and her baby. And imagine, dealing with the morning sickness, carrying, all of this for a full term, and then having a baby who passes away during the final trimester. It's just very heartbreaking. As far as making it to the birth stages, so there's a lot of different methods, and more and more learning about like different ways to prepare yourself mentally for this process, and especially wanting to encourage women to have their babies without any kind of pain relievers, and without as far as medical assistance that way, because obviously it affects the babies. And so having different methods. The most classic and the most popular for the longest time was Lamaze. And Lamaze was, teaching the female how to have muscle relaxation, breathing through her contractions, having a focal point, and having a support person who knows, what to expect, right? That support person needs to know. It may not be all roses and candy, right? Okay, it could be pretty rough and it can get pretty harsh in there. Also, the Mongan method, right, or hypnobirthing, and that is all about like relaxation and using proper breathing through the contractions. It's very similar to Lamaze. And maybe some of you had your child, you're with a midwife, right? Okay, and there are midwives, and this is an area that goes back so far back in history, and also is still very popular to this day. Usually not just because it's more affordable, but also the comfort of maybe having your child at home or in a birthing center, and it being much more like natural for people. But also, I always like to point out there is that huge risk of anything, any kind of complication, right? Okay, if there's any kind of complication, or if you're a high risk, then this is off the table, right? Okay, and so hoping that you've had enough analysis of your baby, you've had enough prenatal diagnosis if there is a high risk for some situation, that you would not pursue a midwife, but instead, make sure that you're in a facility where you're going to have all of the chances, right, of survival for both the mother and the baby. All right. As far as popular water births, people talk about them that they're not as traumatic for infants. There's different videos you can see about them, and and having access to a water birth is sometimes something that is not as popular in certain cities as others. Hospital births are the most common, and they, usually will kick in with pain relief, like an epidural. They'll also work hand in hand with preparing the mother. So a lot of times a hospital runs a Lamaze class or runs a hypnotherapy class. And so that's something that, it's something for you to look into. And I would say your best bet is to do your own research, because it all comes back to what are you going to be most comfortable with yourself? What's going to help alleviate your own discomfort and your concerns, right? And what's going to put you at the most ease as you go into this process. As far as the stages of delivery, we have the first stage of labor, right, which is where the uterine contractions begin, and they tend to be about 15 to 20 minutes apart, and then they start getting closer in frequency, right, and increasing in duration. So they start getting longer, and they start getting less, like more like 3 to 4 minutes apart. So in this first stage, you also have the cervix dilating, right, to 10 centimeters, or just about 4 inches, and it can take anywhere from 12 to 16 hours for your first child, and then it becomes shorter and faster for women who have had previous babies. So the second stage is when the baby actually starts crowning, right? Okay, and you'll see the crowning stage, and the little head starts popping out, and they can take anywhere from 10 to 40 minutes. And that's usually, you'll start seeing, okay, we're gonna call the doctor now, right? If you're in a hospital setting. And it's pretty crazy, because a lot of times they wait until the very, very last minute to call the doctor, and the doctor pops in, delivers a baby, and pops right back out, right? And goes and does their thing somewhere else. And then the third stage is usually, and second stage is like, the crowning. If you're not doing any kind of pain relief, this can be a painful moment, and also very uncomfortable, because this is where females may feel the need to push, and in reality, they'll tell them, no, don't push yet. Wait till you have the next contraction. And it's just ready for that stage, right? Okay, that stage and the first stage I'm sorry, are the hardest stages. The third stage is the easiest, usually pretty painless, and takes about 20 minutes after the delivery of the baby. And this is when the placenta is delivered, and they just need to make sure that they remove all placenta material. Also, this is where they might have to do an episiotomy, and that's not fun. So those are also things to talk to your doctor about. And I don't know why I'm choking so much, but Let's see here. Let's see if I can get through these last few slides. C-sections. Those are usually in advance. If you know you're high risk and the doctor has recommended that you do a C-section, then that would be something you know of in advance. But if there's some kind of emergency C-section, that could be when something, develops during delivery. If you're given the choice up front of a C-section versus natural birth, a lot of women might choose a C-section because they're like, okay, I don't have to go through the actual delivery process. You get to schedule your C-section, in advance. And this kind of actually happened to my sister. She was scheduled for a C-section and she was ready to be going in like at 10 a.m. that morning. But guess what? That baby decided he was coming earlier. And so it was like 5 a.m. when she was like, uh-oh, I'm in contractions, and so there we were rushing her to the hospital. And they were actually successful. The nurses were actually successful at convincing my sister to not have a C-section, even though she had previously had a C-section and she intended to have another one. They were able to convince her, and this was what convinced her the most. They started talking to her about, hey, you're not high risk. Everything's looking great with the baby. Why would you want to deal with a surgical wound and having to have the potential for infection and having to heal from that when you can have a baby naturally, not have to worry about this wound and the pain and the healing? And so that's how they were able to successfully convince her. I was pretty shocked because I thought for sure, nope, she's gonna walk out of here with a C-section. But no, and she was so happy she did afterwards. So those are some things to consider, right? Is a C-section might seem like less painful, it's more scheduled, etc., but also you do have this large, wound, incision that you have to care for, and that can get infected and lead to, additional complications. Once that baby is born, they are assessed using the APGAR scale, and this usually happens within 1 to 5 minutes after the baby's been born. They'll take their heart rate, their breathing, check for muscle tone, they'll look for their reflexes, and they look at their overall color and they score them. Yes, and if they end up with scores lower, with any total scores, yeah, at 5 or lower, then that can be a cause for concern. If a baby is low in their birth weight, right, this can definitely pose a risk because they often will have trouble maintaining their body temperature and they have a higher risk of infection. And so low birth weight babies, like what is caused when you smoke during your pregnancy, are at a higher risk. Also, premature babies, if you're born much earlier than the 37 weeks, can also put that baby at risk. And then there's hypoxia or apoxia, right? Okay, and that would be either not having enough or not having complete oxygen after the birth. And sadly, that can lead to brain damage and many other disorders. And so, infant breathing and their access to oxygen during the birth process and immediately after the birth process, including the maturation of their respiratory system, all pose huge risks to the baby. Finally, this is our quick review. So look this over and I am checking out, right? I hope you found this video helpful, and we'll be having some more videos coming our way for the next unit. Thanks, everyone. Don't forget to do your chapter 3 videos, or your unit 1 video survey. Thanks, everyone.